Hi guys, welcome to my next AP Bio Tutoring video. Today we're going to be talking about macromolecules, entering into our discussion about macromolecules by talking about carbohydrates. The first thing we need to talk about in regards to macromolecules is the fact that they are organic molecules. So what is an organic molecule? And an organic molecule is any molecule that contains carbon and hydrogen. Now, that means if it contains one or the other, it is not an organic molecule. So, for instance, carbon dioxide is not organic because it doesn't have hydrogen. Water is not organic because it does not have carbon. But organic molecules are anything that contain both. And why it has to contain carbon specifically is that carbon can bond with up to 4 other atoms, whether that be another carbon molecule, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus. Any one of those are some of the important ones to know. So I'll say them again: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. Those are some of the more important molecules to know and be able to recognize for the AP test. Carbon can bond with up to 4 of them at a time. And what that basically means is that it's a lot more options, a lot easier for carbon to bond and form large macromolecules. And that's really what a macromolecule is, a large molecule. And so we're going to specifically be talking about carbohydrates today. The other 3 groups of macromolecules, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, I will touch on in a later video because it's a lot of information. So I've decided to split it up. And so we're going to first talk about your carbohydrates and how to identify a carbohydrate when you see it on your AP test. Because if you look at a molecule and you don't know what it is, then you're not going to be able to know its function and its structure. And so, obviously, the first thing you want to look for is an organic molecule, because all macromolecules are organic. And so if it has carbon and hydrogen in it, you know it's an organic molecule. So what's next? How do you tell if it's a carbohydrate? Well, there's a couple ways to do it depending on what information you're given. If you were given first the chemical formula, you're given the formula for the molecule, then it's useful to know that all carbohydrates have the same formula, just with different amounts of things. So your formula is C, H, and O with different subscripts depending on what carbohydrate you're looking at. All carbohydrates follow this formula. And now the other important thing to know is that all carbohydrates have the ratio 1 to 2 to 1. So you will always have the same amount of carbon and oxygen. The amounts of both atoms will be equal, and hydrogen will be twice that amount. One of the famous examples is the result of photosynthesis glucose, which has a chemical formula of C6H12O6, and you can see it's following that 1 to 2 to 1 formula. So that's how to identify a carbohydrate if you see its formula on the AP test. How about if you see its name? If you are given the name of a molecule, you need to figure out what it is. Well, all carbohydrates, I shouldn't say all, most carbohydrates end in the suffix -ose, whether that's glucose, fructose. Any of those, if it ends in -ose, it is a carbohydrate. Now, most carbohydrates end in -ose. There are a couple exceptions that you'll see later in the video. We'll talk about a couple exceptions, but we will be going over the more common of those exceptions so you are able to identify them when you see them on the test. And the third way to identify a carbohydrate is by its structure and by a diagram of it. And so we're going to be going over what the structure of a carbohydrate is in detail so you guys can identify it and know its properties on the AP test. So the main structure of a carbohydrate, the basic structure, is a hexagon-shaped ring. and that is the monomer of your carbohydrate. You might see that referred to as a simple carbohydrate or a simple sugar, and these do exist on their own. Fructose is a simple sugar. It is a single monomer of a carbohydrate, and what we call these monomers for carbohydrates are monosaccharides. So a monosaccharide is the monomer for carbohydrates. And you can remember that because monomer and monosaccharides have the same root, mono, meaning one. And so what happens when two monosaccharides get close together? Well, they form a covalent bond between them. And this bond forms a disaccharide. And a disaccharide is just two monosaccharides stuck together through a covalent bond known as a glycosidic linkage. Sorry, I just have to check my notes there. So a glycosidic linkage forms the bond between two monosaccharides to form a disaccharide. Once you start having 3 or more monosaccharides joined together, it is called a polysaccharide. So you get 3 or more, and now you have a polysaccharide. And this is the polymer for a carbohydrate. And so now this right here, this bond right here, is the glycosidic linkage. Glycosidic linkage. Write that down. And the glycosidic linkage is a covalent bond between the two molecules. And how is that bond formed? It's formed through a process called dehydration synthesis. And during that process, water leaves the molecule. Your byproduct is water, which is why it's called dehydration synthesis. You're taking away the water molecule. And so now it takes a lot of energy to form that covalent bond. And that energy is now stored in the molecule, which brings us to its functions. So once again, here's the structure of the carbohydrates. And I'll take a picture of this diagram and put it up as well so you guys can reference it. But now we're going to get on to the structure of the carbohydrates. Not structure, function. And function of any macromolecule, of any organic molecule, is determined by its structure. And so, the main functions of a carbohydrate are energy storage, energy production, and structural support of the cell, mainly in the cell wall. And so energy production is a more minor function of it that's typically handled by ATP and proteins in the ribosomes and all that. So that's not the one we're going to focus on. We're going to focus more on energy storage and structural support. So energy storage is the primary function of carbohydrates in all organisms. And this is taken care of by different molecules depending on what type of organism you're dealing with. And these molecules are some of the ones that have names that don't end in "-ose", and these are the more common ones you're going to see. So definitely pay attention to what we have here so that you can recognize these as carbohydrates when you see them. And so your first energy storage molecule is starch. And starch is the energy storage molecule found in plants. Meanwhile, in animals, you have glycogen. So those are your energy storage molecules. And how does the carbohydrate store energy? Well, it takes a lot of energy to form a covalent bond between monosaccharides. And in those covalent bonds, the energy is stored because when they are broken, energy is released from the molecule. And so when a cell has excess energy, it'll store it by creating this covalent bond. Then later when it needs that energy, it'll break the bonds and allow the cell to use that energy. And so the other major function of carbohydrates is structural support. This is not found in animal cells. We don't have structural support carbohydrates. These are typically found in the cell walls of cells, so you're looking more at plants and fungi when it comes to these. And your molecules for this are cellulose. There's that "-ose" again at the end, that suffix "-ose", identifying as a carbohydrate. And cellulose is found in plants. And only certain animals can digest and break down cellulose to use in their bodies. And so that's why certain animals cannot eat plants and survive off of plants, because they don't have the proper enzymes to break down the cellulose. And the other molecule is chitin, and that's found in fungi cell walls. And so structural support in fungi and plant cell walls is the other major function of carbohydrates. So once again, I'll draw a diagram one more time of the carbohydrates. Here is the monosaccharide. It bonds together with another one to form a disaccharide through a glycosidic linkage formed by dehydration synthesis. That is a disaccharide there. And then when a third one is added on, you have a polysaccharide. And now, again, it's important to note that the structure of these glycosidic linkages allow for energy storage and structural support in the cell from the carbohydrate. It's also important to know that your carbohydrate might not be a straight line. It can branch off into multiple paths of the carbohydrate, and the carbohydrate itself might just be one path, but it can bend in different directions. And so the most important thing to look for on carbohydrate is the ose, or the hexagon-shaped ring identifying the monomer. And once again, you have the functions here: energy storage and structural support, which are determined by the structure of the carbohydrate. Carbohydrate, the first of the organic molecules, and I'll be covering the rest of them in future videos.